The ACC appears to be in even more dire straits than it had been last week, when rumors that USC and UCLA were joining the Big Ten surfaced. The ACC appears to be in even more dire straits than it had been last week, when rumors that USC and UCLA were joining the Big Ten surfaced. With the Big Ten and SEC closing in on the establishment of college sports Cold War, a polarized world in which these two superconferences can consolidate enough money and influence to establish a monopoly on elite college athletics, the remainder of the Power Five is searching for a place in that world. And so far, it seems like the Big 12 has taken an early lead, while the ACC has been caught a little stunned, and the Pac-12 is falling into disarray. Kind of two parts to this conversation that go hand in hand a little bit. The first is strategy, and the second is timing. We can dive into the strategy part first. So the first thing we got to understand is that schools make conferences, not the other way around. When you think about where the ACC was about 6 years ago, FSU won the conference title. Louisville was a strong team, a team to be reckoned with. Georgia Tech was not kind of the pushover that they are now. Well, even Duke made a conference title appearance. There was a conference title game appearance. There was a lot more depth to the league, and just having different teams on top every year or so can really change what people think of your conference and can alter the kind of standing that this conference has in kind of the national conversation about college football. The same thing goes for the Pac-12. I believe it was 4 or 5 years ago when Washington won the conference title and made it to the playoff. There was just a completely different perception because Washington was a strong team. They went down like they are now. Same goes for Stanford and Arizona State. These were competitive teams that have since fallen off. And so you just think about how the perception of these conferences was so different. It's not necessarily because the conferences themselves changed. It wasn't like, and it wasn't like this reputation that the Pac-12 has had as perpetually kind of weak, or the ACC is perpetually kind of weak, particularly in football. That wasn't always the case, and down periods for schools like I mentioned, Washington, Arizona State, Stanford, but then also Miami and Florida State, and maybe even throw Louisville or Georgia Tech in there. Those can really color external perception, and the fact that both those conferences have had some of their key schools go through down years has really colored the conversation that we're having now about realignment. So, kind of bouncing off of that, the rest of the world is using brute force to kind of cover for these deficiencies. So, most obviously, the SEC and the Big Ten are using their money and their clout and the promise of something bigger to attract the big names like the USC's, UCLA, Texas, Oklahoma. And then now there are even reports about, kind of unsubstantiated just yet and unconfirmed just yet, but that Clemson, UNC, FSU, and Miami are trying to find a way out of the ACC and into the SEC. So you can just see the gravitational pull of those schools. They can just kind of throw money at the problem and use their reputation and that money to get people to come into their sphere and to side with them, I guess, if you want to put it that way. Meanwhile, the ACC seems to be kind of adapting or clinging to this old order of coexistence. This is where we kind of get into the timing aspect of it a little bit, but the ACC is treating this a little bit like a problem for the distant future when in fact it's immediately pressing. So this week there have been reports about them forming a loose partnership with the Pac-12, and later this week, today there have been reports that they are doing something a little bit more concrete. They are talking about a merger of their kind of TV apparatuses. The ACC's ACC network is a little bit stronger, not even a little bit, because the Pac-12 network was so ineffective at its mission. But the ACC network has been a little bit more effective at that mission. It's much more widely carried, I guess you could say, by cable companies in the Pac-12 network, which is kind of obscure and would cost you a bunch of money to get in your cable package, but it's not the case for the ACC network, which is a little more ubiquitous. But the ACC is not really doing anything. They're not making these really hard moves like even the Big 12 is, which seems like the ACC's opponent for kind of the scraps of the Pac-12. But it seems like the ACC is kind of banking on the Pac-12 existing beyond this round of conference realignment, while the Big 12 is all in on breaking it down and accepting this new world. And this is where we get into the timing part of it, is because the ACC is kind of hampered by a couple of things. They're hampered by, first of all, their grant of rights agreement, which kind of controls how or why it kind of controls their member schools, and because it is attached to TV revenue and their media rights deal with ESPN, which is where a bunch of the conference revenue comes from, and the conference revenue payouts. It artificially keeps these schools attached to the conference and keeps them loyal to it. That runs through 2036. So there's not an immediate way out. I was reading kind of an explainer on it today, but essentially if one of these schools that I mentioned, Clemson, UNC, FSU, Miami, who were in that kind of unsubstantiated reports, but they all definitely seem like the category of schools that will ditch the ACC if the opportunity arrives. If one of them wants to leave, they will have to pay for the remainder of their media rights agreement with the ACC. So they would get a portion of the total revenue that is paid out by the conference. They would have to pay annually through 2036. So whenever they leave, it would be It'd be 2036 minus X many years. If they left this year, they would have to pay another 14 years of media rights. And when I say pay, I mean just that any money that the ACC generates from its TV deal would be their own. They wouldn't have to pay it to a school that leaves. So these schools would be surrendering a lot of money, and they have to kind of do the calculus about whether or not that is worth, whether the SEC or the Big Ten, wherever they end up going, can pay them enough money to cover for those costs. They are also hampered a little bit by Notre Dame's patience. If the ACC was to make kind of a big-time move and to attract a big revenue-generating and eyeball-grabbing school, it would be in Notre Dame. Maybe you throw Washington or Oregon in there, but they are still not even kind of on that same plane. But Notre Dame, by all accounts, is kind of standing pat. They're comfortable where they are as an independent. I think they're self-assured in their own kind of status, I guess you could say, as one of the major brands in college sports, and particularly college football. So that has kind of prevented the ACC from doing a whole lot. The same kind of goes for Oregon and Washington, which are kind of the two big fish out west. They also seem to be more patient. They don't have an immediate path to the Big Ten, according to what reports that I saw this morning. So they are not, pressed to jump for the ACC or whatever. If they can kind of keep that hope of getting the Big Ten alive, then they will do that too. But that doesn't kind of excuse the fact that the ACC is not really giving these big fish, Clemson, Florida State, North Carolina, Miami, and I guess now Virginia, maybe is in that pot as well. But you're not giving them a reason to want to stick around. You're not making moves aggressively enough that should give them any faith that this conference is built for the long haul. And that would concern me if I'm one of these schools, and it would encourage me to look elsewhere and prepare my plan B. As much as staying in the ACC might be preferable just for familiarity, or I guess it'd just be familiarity if you can't pay them as much money, but you're not making this an attractive deal for them. You're not, again, giving them any reason to want to stick around or to have any faith in them. Especially as the Big 12 starts to engage in talks with other Pac-12 teams like Arizona State, Arizona, Colorado, Utah, as reports from this week claim. Big 12 is clearly moving faster and more aggressively, and they seem like the one, at least right now, that has a leg up on sticking around in the, as I've seen it referred to as this week, the scramble to create that third power league. That's kind of a step below the SEC and the Big Ten, but still maintains the elite status that these conferences held when they were all kind of the Power Five together. And this is kind of frustrating, if I would have to imagine, if you're in the ACC, because you haven't lost anything yet. Your big players are still there. Everything's kind of on the table for you. You can still sell this. You can still have, like, I think, a much stronger argument than the Big 12 right now. You have a much stronger roster of member schools between Clemson, FSU, Miami, even North Carolina and Virginia. Those are definitely, I mean, you think about the Big 12, it's Baylor, Oklahoma State, and Texas Tech after Oklahoma and Texas leave. Like, those are your Baylor, OSU, Texas Tech. Those are your big fish, and those are not as big a fish as, Clemson, FSU, Miami. So you have built in, like, better reasons for, and that's, like, not even mentioning the broadcasting service, the ACC network. That's something that the Big 12 doesn't have. Something that ubiquitous and easily accessible, and also just good. Like, it's good. The ACC broadcasts a lot of sport. The ACC network broadcasts a lot of sports, dedicates a lot of coverage to the conference. Like, it's a good thing for the SEC. In theory, they should be the more attractive place for schools to want to land. But because of how passively they're behaving right now, they are kind of lagging